they actually are successful and kill or injure U.S. forces, the consequences are going to be substantial and quick. I mean, we have surge forces to the region. I believe there's a third aircraft carrier strike group, the Ford, coming out to the region. Um, the capability to respond in a very substantial way is there. And of course, these are housed in countries that they're trying to, at least in the past, recent past, improve relations. So they would further damage their relations with all these countries in doing so.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy. Mick, thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be back with you, Louis.
Good to have you. Well, you're in Abu Dhabi at the moment, I believe. What's the feeling there about the ongoing air war between Israel and Iran?
Well, I think there's a lot of concern in all of the countries of the Gulf, including the UAE, for obvious reasons. I mean, this conflict is destabilizing the region, and the potential retaliation by Iran against the nuclear facility strikes by the United States, at least one of the options could include the sea mining and the obstruction of the Straits of Hormuz, which of course would block a considerable portion of the oil coming out of the Gulf going to countries around the world. About 20% of the world's energy comes from this. And it would really have an impact. It would also have an impact, of course, on Iran, because about 100% of Iran's oil is shipped through the same strait. So it's not going to be, if you sea mine it, then it's going to be agnostic as far as what ship it hits and sinks. So it would be very consequential to Iran to do this, and they would probably seriously anger China, who gets a lot of their energy from this region. So hopefully it won't happen, but it's a concern that I think all of them have. For sure.
And of course, the UAE, where you are now, does have its own border of sorts with the Straits of Hormuz. Presumably, there's a very acute fear about this in the region itself, but also in the US.
That's right. And the UAE does have a way to bypass through pipelines. I think it's called the Fujairah pipeline, if I'm correct. But that's not ideal. You know, they could ship a lot more, like 20 million barrels a day. I might have that wrong. I had somebody texting me about that. It's a lot. It's a lot, right? So, but they have a way around. I think Iran might, but I think it comes out so close to the actual straits that it would actually be impacted by the sea mines, which don't stay in place, or many of them will, float in that direction. Now, if that does happen, and I don't know that it will, and I could see a lot of reasons why it won't, including the fact that it would significantly hurt Iran's ability to sell its own oil and anger the rest of the world against Iran. If it does happen, the U.S. military, the U.S. Navy is about the only Navy that has a capacity to clear those straits, and it would take potentially months. And then, of course, even after the U.S. military declared it clear, commercial ships still have to believe it's clear, and insurance companies still have to believe it's clear to insure the ships that go through there. So it could be a horrible situation for a long period of time for all the countries, including the one I'm in, and all the countries that rely on the energy from this region.
And just finally on the idea of this blockade, when we saw the Houthis trying to blockade international shipping in the Red Sea using strikes, I mean, perhaps less impactful than a full blockade might be. We saw a pretty massive response from the West and especially from the US to that. Could this bring a similar sort of military response, or would it mostly just be mine clearing, do you think?
I think it could be both. I mean, there has to be mine clearing to actually open it back up. And the Houthis have said, I think today, that they intend to really focus on the Bab el Mandeb, another maritime choke point. And they would likely do. I don't believe they have the level of sea mines that the IRGC Navy does, but they have missiles and drone ships, for example, that they got from Iran. In large part, and they could amp up their attacks, and then you'd have to see a considerable response by the international community, even more so than there is now. But it's important to point out this has less impact on the United States. The U.S., for the most part, doesn't rely on energy for the Gulf anymore. So I think the U.S. would likely clear it because we're I think, the only Navy that can actually do it. And I might be wrong on that, but that's what I've been told in the past, when I was at the Pentagon. Um, but it would be clearing it so we could help international trade, energy to resume for the benefit of everyone. But that would be a big decision of the United States. It's very risky. And they might have to basically secure themselves by taking out the naval positions of the Iranians on the coast, because these are very slow moving vessels that are very vulnerable. So, in order for them to do the mine clearing, unless Iran was absolutely not going to attack it, which we wouldn't know, that would escalate this substantially. I don't think they will do this. It's just not in their interest. They would seriously anger China, who's one of their own only or very few, I'd say, allies here. But it is an option, and we all saw that the parliament in Iran approved it as one of the options.
And how crucial is that support from China as an ally to Iran?
Well, they don't. Well, one of the biggest things that China does for Iran right now is buy its oil. So that's why there's been so much talk uh, about that, and about having sanctions, that would make this much more difficult for Iran to sell its oil, um, and therefore reduce its ability to fund its government and its regime. But we'll see.
But the US seems to be taking the threat quite seriously all the same. I mean, we've seen US aircraft and things being moved out of bases in the region to bases further away from Iran. Um, there is still a quite realistic threat, even if the response would be quite severe for Iran.
That's right, and I think the U.S. Wants this to be one and done. That they had the opportunity to strike these facilities. There was essentially no air defense and no air force. So the biggest issue when doing this with these, I mean, they're super sophisticated aircraft, the B-2 Spirit, but they're very vulnerable. So Israel, the IDF, had essentially eliminated the threat. So it was the opportune time militarily, and the U.S. was the only military that could do it based on having the B-2, which is capable of carrying what's called the GBU 57, it's a 30,000 pound massive ordnance penetrator. So we don't know the full battle damage assessment. Obviously, it caused a lot of damage just from the sheer volume that was expended. But the BDA, as they call it, will be coming out, and it shapes over time, right? So there's HUMINT, SIGINT, IMINT, which is all different types of intelligence that adds up over time, and they should give them a good picture of just how much damage was done.
And we have had reports today of another strike on the Fordo nuclear site in Iran. How should we read into that? I mean, is that a sort of expected follow up strike, or is it possible the first ones might not have had the intended impact? I mean, we understand it is quite an elaborate underground and quite well hardened target there, isn't it?
It might be. I don't know. I mean, 12 GBU 57s. I mean, that's a lot of firepower there. So it might have been something they missed. It might have been like trying to cover up something. I don't mean cover up in the sense of like criminal thing, but a cover up like damage an entry point that wasn't hit somehow. I mean, because most of these, what was fired there, they don't detonate till they're 200 feet below the surface, right? So there might have been something that was missed up top. I just don't know. But I have to think the question was, could they reach? And they thought that maybe, and we don't know, but maybe Fordo went down 300 feet, and these generally get to 200 feet before they explode. But that's why they tried to launch them so they were going right almost in the same hole and going down ventilation shafts, which would make it potentially go further than it normally does. So they don't know, and they'll just try to assess it. But the one thing that Israel still does is they have air dominance over Iran. So I imagine that they're going to be looking at this and trying to see if they're trying to rebuild it, um, all that stuff. And they can always take further strikes until there's a ceasefire, and that doesn't seem to be in the works right now.
And we know at least some of the Iranian nuclear program is mobile. There's reports of this 400 kilograms of nuclear material that is essentially unaccounted for at the moment. How concerned are the US or Israel, for that matter, going to be about the Iranian regime just moving and hiding as much of their program as possible before it can be targeted?
That's a good point, Louis. I think they're going to be very concerned. I mean, we've seen a lot, even in open source with imaging, and the trucks were there before the strikes, and I think that's a major focal point of the U.S. intelligence community, and obviously the Israeli intelligence community. I think they're trying to find out just what did survive, if they moved it somewhere else, where that somewhere else would be. The Iranian regime said very clearly before this happened that if they were struck, they would definitely go toward a nuclear program. Now, I don't know why they would forecast that. It's just going to cause this conflict to go on longer and get more, interest from intelligence community. But they did. So, sometimes when your enemy from the U.S. point of view and Israel's point of view says what they're going to do, you should listen to them. So I think that is a huge focal point right now of both countries' intelligence collection.
And I know this might be something of a difficult question, but do we have any idea of how long the conflict could go on for, and the extent that the US will continue to be involved?
Well, we do know, we think we know that they have a finite amount of ballistic missiles, and that seems to be their weapon of choice. Nothing else works. They really don't have an air force. Obviously, it's going to be a ground type conflict. Um, and Israel has spent a lot of effort destroying their manufacturing facilities. So if they get to a point where they simply don't have anything else to launch, they could do terrorism. They could do we already talked about Straits of Hormuz, but it would appear to most that it's almost a ceasefire, right? Because they're not firing anything at Israel, and maybe Israel would stop. But we don't know, and we don't, and the Iranian foreign ministers in Moscow today most assume they're asking for military support, not actual participation, but weapons and defensive systems like the S-400 and stuff. Iran has been providing Russia the same things for their war in Ukraine. So that could happen. And that would extend this even further. Hopefully, Russia wouldn't do that. And certainly, as soon as Israel sees an S-400 starting to be set up, they're going to strike it. But they could simply run out of um, weapon systems to launch at Israel, and that could bring this to an end. We'll have to see. It all depends on the retaliation, I think, right now from Iran from the strikes.
And have you seen much of how this is being judged back at home for the US? Obviously, there's this debate between interventionism and non-interventionism, especially within the MAGA group, which is often seen as being non-interventionist. Where do you think the reaction is going to be at home to the US involvement here?
So I do think you're correct that there is a separation within the Republican Party. There's what I would call traditional Republicans, in line of the Reagans, the Bush era, that believed in a robust overseas and in some cases intervention. I think if there's somebody that represents that still in the administration, would be Secretary Rubio. But then there's also a very isolationist strand, particularly in MAGA. So a part of the Republican Party that's obviously very closely aligned with President Trump. That would be represented, I think, in large part by Vice President Vance. He's obviously going to support the president and what he does, but in the past, that's been a big issue with him. So right now, it looks like President Trump has gone with a direct interventionist stance, direct strike on Iran. So there's that issue, and there's also the issue in Congress, where not only were they not notified prior to taking this and given the ability to approve or disapprove. That happens a lot with presidential decisions. There's a thing called the War Powers Act in the United States. It essentially says that's supposed to happen, but most presidents ignore it, and the Supreme Court hasn't weighed in to a point where we know what the right answer is. The other part of that is the Gang of Eight, which is both Republicans and Democrats that are the leaders in Senate and House and on the key committees like defense and intelligence, are all notified prior to a strike. They don't ask approval, but they're notified. The Democrats and the Gang Eight were not notified, and that is unusual. And I think that it might set a standard. So then the next Democratic president decides not to, notify the Republicans, and I don't think that's a good stance. That's something that hopefully doesn't become a trend.
And as you say, Mick, there is this sort of grey area about what authority the president has to act unanimously on foreign intervention like this. At what point would Trump need to get the Congress and that Gang of Eight involved to get authorization for further action in the Middle East and in support of Israel?
So there is specifics laid out in the War Powers Act, but again, most presidents have not considered that binding on them. They say it's unconstitutional because they're the commander in chief under the Article 2 of the Constitution. But there is something Congress does because they approve budgets. Eventually, if you had a long, drawn out conflict, they could stop funding it, and they could, of course, stop funding the government and the Defense Department if they really were unified against that. So that's the issue. And this obviously, the U.S. military had enough funding to carry out this very precise, and to be frank, very impressive operation. I mean, it's only the U.S. military that could carry this out, quite frankly. That is one of their options that they could do, but that wouldn't happen when it's a very specific mission like this because they already have the funding.
And posting on Truth Social, Donald Trump has sort of mentioned or well, quite strongly hinted at the idea of regime change in Iran. Is now the right time for that? I mean, you're in the Middle East region at the moment. Would regime change in Iran now not be somewhat destabilizing?
That's the big concern, and that's a big concern also in the region with people I've talked to. That obviously they're no fans of Khomeini either. Khomeini's and their proxies have fired at Saudi Arabia and the UAE, drones and all. There's a big fight against the Houthis in Yemen, led by the Saudis, and that was their biggest concern is the Iranian regime. So they're no fans of them, but I think, and I was not speaking from them, they're concerned about major destabilization, the fractionalization of Iran, multiple different distinct groups, what would come out of it. I think from Israel's perspective, anything would be better than the guy that spends his entire life talking about the elimination of their country. And you can understand that from that perspective. I think the U.S. to a lesser extent, yeah, well, I mean, what's worse? But you don't know what you don't know. So that's the question that people are asking, and it's I don't think there's really a major concerted effort to do a regime change other than rhetoric, other than and potentially targeting Supreme Leader. That would be a very emphatic regime change. But apparently he's already named his successor, and I imagine the successor is in line with him. So it might not change much of their perspective toward the region, their destabilization. They are the most destabilizing force in the Middle East. It's unquestionable. And any of the countries in the Middle East would tell you that, not just Israel. But, regime change, you don't know what you're going to get. It could get worse. There's hardliners that are, now screaming that they should have raced for a nuclear weapon long ago and they wouldn't be in this predicament. So they could easily take over, especially within the IRGC, which is a big proponent of that.
And yeah, you mentioned that the views inside Iran to all of this at the moment. I mean, is there any evidence that these strikes and this conflict now has brought Iran any closer to the negotiating table on their nuclear regime?
They have to save face. That's one of the biggest things they do. If there's something that happens that doesn't cause it to escalate, but does give them the ability to say, "Look, we responded, and we're not, completely weak." I hope we can get back to the negotiation table. The issue is, I think the U.S. wants a nuclear agreement. I think President Trump wants a nuclear agreement. He has to make it more stringent than the one he pulled out of, the 2015 JCPOA. I don't know that Israel would like any of them, but I think President Trump would like to see this end in an agreement that he can say he accomplished, and then Iran would also, and I think this would be a benefit for everybody, get sanctions relieved and potentially join the rest of the world. And then there would be a lot of pressure from the Iranian people not to screw that up, because they would do very well on the international market. They are very innovative, very modern, and they would do really well. But they're just held back because of the sanctions. And the sanctions are there because of the actions of the regime. And let's face it, they did enrich uranium up to 60%. There's no reason to do that unless you were trying to get to a nuclear weapon. You don't need it for medical purposes. You don't need it for energy. That's way, way above it. So Iran did everything to stick their finger in the eyes of the countries, which is just about every country, that doesn't want to see them get a nuclear weapon. And so a lot of this is the consequences of their actions. And hopefully they can understand or get pressure internally that gets them back to the table so that they can not only agree not to get a nuclear weapon, which they're further away from now after these strikes, but also get sanctions relief for the people of Iran who deserve it.
And Trump has said last week that Iran doesn't want to talk to the EU and European nations about their nuclear program. Is there any role now for European nations in this and in negotiations, or is this just between Israel, Iran, and the US?
So I don't know. I mean, I think having partners in these negotiations can help leverage you diplomatically. So I would hope the U.S. would. That I mean, in the original agreement, certainly France, and the U.K., and was it Germany? Yeah, I think that was, when it came to Europe, were part of it, and there's still, a remnant of it that exists. We pulled out unilaterally in 2018, but I would hope that the U.S. would use the diplomatic pressure that the Europeans can exert to get Iran back to an agreement that we could all join that's more stringent than the 2015, which for political reasons, for sure, President Trump needs to get to.
Former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, Mick Mulroy, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.
Thanks, Louis.